Okay, here we go with volume 2. Uh, I'm now going to shift to the second book, A Theology of Love, the dynamic uh, of, of Wesleyanism. Uh, John Wesley's tradition, we could say. Mildred Bangs Wynkoop is the author. Uh, I won't go to all my history, but I have a rich history of debt and appreciation for Mildred Bangs Wynkoop. I read this book, A Theology of Love, roughly when I was your age. Maybe I was a senior in college. And let's just say it had a huge impact on me. In her preface to this book, which came out in 1972, I read it in 1977, so it had been out 5 years. In her preface, she actually mentions this book, sort of in terms of her indebtedness to Daniel Day Williams, and this book, The Spirit and the Forms of Love. And she writes, Williams contributes what I believe to be a more biblical approach to love, agape, the Greek word translated love. She's comparing him to another writer in that regard. And that's really the only time she mentions Williams, but she didn't have to do that, and she did, and I've always taken it as a strong hint. And you can tell in her writing that the kind of thing we just shared from Williams made its way into Mildred Bangs Wynkoop. So this is going to come from page 105 in her book, A Theology of Love. And the chapter title is Man Made in the Image of God. If she were writing it today, she would have changed this term man. I know she would. I won't go into something that really bugs me, so I won't. She kind of says under this heading, Christian man, and she has Christian in quotation marks. There have been two main theories about man and God's image in Christian history. One is the substantial, and the other the relational. So when she talks about the substantial, she's basically talking about what Williams also talked about as the approach that he was rejecting in favor, basically, of love as a description of healthy, self-giving, other-receiving relationship. So we'll say, so I think this is in your handout. The substance theory is based on the idea that something in the human being can be identified as the image of God. Notice then, the image of God in man is the typical expression. Now, she's going to comment more on this in a minute, but we do hear the phrase, the image of God in human beings or in man, a lot. Historically, a lot. Even in this book, where Williams is trying to get away from the idea of like the image of God being something inherent in us, he also uses, I think it just had that kind of, formative power in people's writing and language to say the image of God in man. Wynkoop points out, and she's probably the one I first learned this from, the Bible doesn't say anything about the image of God in us. First of all, it doesn't talk that much at all about human beings in the image of God. But when it does, it's human beings created in God's image, which you don't even need me to tell you, that's a very different, already a different concept than the image of God in us. Okay? So this is one of my pet theological peeves, and I want to share it with you. Every time you hear somebody say the image of God in man or in human beings, just scream and say, Lord, told me I had to. I feel the same way about that whole Imago Dei thing. Give us a break. Just give us English. Anyway, so, Lord, ranting again. Then either if you go with the image of God in the human being, either a corporeal substance. I don't know how many people ever have tried to identify a corporeal substance in the human, but she does better in the next part, or some function of the human person, such as reason, a divine spark, creative ability. Of course, the list is much longer than those possibilities, or being in possession of a spirit as well as a soul and a body, that this would distinguish human beings from non-human beings. And I know I have a footnote that I've supplied there, just acknowledging, and I know I've already talked to you about this, so I was glad the footnote was pertinent, that John Wesley himself, whom she wants to try to write a theology that sort of honors his big themes, but we'd all have to admit that Wesley, in his time, 18th century, was quite ready to identify the image of God, we'll say, in human beings as the soul, right? The soul in the human being. But again, if you're moving away from something in me, some essence in me, to, first of all, William's relationship, we can even say first relationship to God and then to other people, you're moving away from like sort of the individualistic notion of there's something in each of us, this divine spark or whatever, that is the image of God. The loss of the imago Dei, there she goes using it, the loss of the image of God in this view does not change the manners, it's a weird word there, manners of man, but does constitute a loss of whatever it is that relates man to God. So that's again the substance theory. I'm going to skip a paragraph because I think in your handout I skipped a paragraph. She then says the relational view. Okay, so you can clearly feel the resonance with Daniel Day Williams here. The relational view stresses a completely different approach to the subject. There is no need to find some entity, feature, or function in the human being that identifies him as human. This is not always convincing to try to find this. It's not always convincing in any case. It's not convincing at all. So I'm with her there. It is man before God and the communication between them, the mutual response, the relation of one to the other, the mirroring, reflecting of one in the other that points to the meaning. Points to the meaning, period. I probably end it there, but let me go ahead and finish this section. Wesley wrote, quote, man is capable of God. Capable of God. Interesting phrase, huh? It is a posture, an inner attitude. I don't know why it's just an inner attitude toward God, a fundamental position one takes toward God and the will of God. Man made in the image of God, which is the biblical wording, distinguishes this view from, quote, the image of God in man, okay, end of quotation, which is typical of the substance concept. So I was one of Dr. Wynkoop's students as a seminary student. That's why I included that photograph of me. That was, it was on the seminary's website at some point. The seminary being Nazarene Theological Seminary. I will just tell you, it was reading this book. I was raised a Nazarene. I gone to this Nazarene college in Nampa, Idaho. I felt like I was ready for let's get beyond the Nazarene thing for a while. And one of my really influential professor, Dr. C.S. Coles, talked me into otherwise. He counseled me to go to NTS, Nazarene Theological Seminary, and I did, but I made the decision after I finished this book, because by the time I read this book, she had become a theologian in residence. She was teaching, part-time at the seminary, and I thought, wow, if the Nazarene Seminary can employ this woman who wrote this book, maybe I'll stick with my camp for a little longer. And I'm really glad I did. I got to take several classes from her. And I'm sure that my strong feeling about the biblical language is human beings in God's image, rather than the image of God being something in the individual human. Now, what I want to press it beyond what both Williams and Wynkoop do. I think they both want to talk about relationship both to God and to the other human being. Maybe one or both of them reminds us that when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandments in the Torah, he says, number one is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But as only the Gospel of Matthew next puts it, there you see, unique to Matthew. And the second command, there's a second commandment very like the first. And you all know that's love your neighbor as yourself. And then also only in Matthew, Jesus then says, on these two commandments, hang, like putting a robe up on a peg on the wall, hang the law and the prophets. On these two commandments, hang the law and the prophets. So one could easily say that even on the basis of this response, that a good gospel understanding of human beings in God's image is that we are created to love, to receive love and to give love. We'll say first to God, but also to others, and you can't really cheese these out from one another. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to come back to something that neither one says. I don't blame them. Theology just wasn't on this vibe quite yet, although certainly people have, even Wesley talked about this a little bit, and that is that Genesis 1, it might imply something about loving God, but it doesn't say that. It might imply this relationship between human beings, as Karl Barth insisted that the language of Adam as male and female, I talked about already, implied human relationship. But frankly, in Genesis 1, the language of image of God is first and foremost, and basically even exclusively, about imaging God to the non-human world, to all those other creatures. Whatever it means to have dominion. And there's other language there we can talk about later. Language that undoubtedly I think has been misused and misappropriated often. But the main point here is that in Genesis 1, image of God is way more of like a calling or a vocation that God beckons us toward. And it, first of all, in Genesis has to do with how we relate to, doggies, kitties, cockroaches. Coco's back there napping. She's so cute. Tamed animals and not tamed animals, pelicans, pandas. I already mentioned those types, didn't I? But the human relationship to what I like to call the more than human world is really, really at the forefront in Genesis 1. That also comes up, and maybe it already has in the book Renewal and Love. But I want to give this quick sort of, flyover on the language of humanity created in God's image, humanity as male and female. So let me add, I did say this in class one day, but let me just say it real quick, and I'm almost done with this video. Given that it's male and female, Adam is male and female, and remembering that Adam is, first of all, not an individual at all, but all of humanity, even our tendency to reduce, even if we were to go with the relational thing, it's very tempting to think of it, well, it's about the individual person in relationship to God and to other human beings, and maybe the individual person in relationship to the more than human world. Where I think in Genesis 1, it's really far more Adam as the whole collective of humanity being given this vocation by our Creator that has to do with reflecting God, reflecting God's character, God's love for the creatures, God's delight in those creatures and inviting them to flourish, but it's like given to Adam as we'll say as a collective. Obviously, that means you have individual responsibilities, but the primary notion here is all of us together as human beings. Remember that in Genesis 1, Adam is not about Christians, it's not about Jews, it's not Muslims, Buddhists, or anything. It's Adam. It's all of humanity. Okay, that's plenty. Amen.